But identifying the suspect was only the first step. Building a case strong enough to secure a conviction would require much more than DNA evidence alone. Investigators would need to trace Chen's movements, gather physical evidence, and construct a timeline that definitively placed him at the Ramsey home on Christmas night 1996. The hunt for Thomas Michael Chen was about to begin, and after 28 years, justice for JonBenét finally seemed within reach. But as investigators would soon discover, catching a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of hiding his true identity would be more challenging than they had ever imagined. The identification of Thomas Michael Chen as the primary suspect in JonBenét Ramsey's murder sent shockwaves through the investigation team. After 28 years of dead ends and false leads, they finally had a name, a face, and a genetic profile that matched the DNA evidence from the crime scene. But Chen was no ordinary suspect. The 62-year-old man had spent the better part of 3 decades living under false identities, moving from state to state and carefully covering his tracks. When investigators began digging into his background, they discovered a pattern of deception that was as sophisticated as it was disturbing. Chen had been born in Denver in 1962, the youngest of 3 children in what appeared to be a normal middle-class family. His father worked as an accountant, his mother was a school teacher, and his older siblings both went on to have successful careers. By all outward appearances, there was nothing in Chen's early life that would suggest he would become a killer. The first signs of trouble emerged during Chen's teenage years. He was arrested twice for breaking and entering, both times involving homes where families with young children lived. The incidents were dismissed as juvenile pranks, and Chen received probation rather than jail time. It was a decision that would have tragic consequences decades later. After high school, Chen drifted from job to job, never staying in one place for very long. He worked as a maintenance worker, a delivery driver, and eventually found employment with Mountain View Catering, a small company that served the affluent neighborhoods around Boulder. It was this job that would give him access to the Ramsey family's world. Court documents later revealed that Mountain View Catering had been hired to provide services for at least 6 events in the Ramsey's neighborhood during the fall and winter of 1996. Chen was part of the crew that worked these events, giving him opportunities to observe the routines of multiple families, including the Ramseys. The catering company's records showed that Chen had worked a holiday party at a house on 15th Street on December 20th, 1996, just 5 days before JonBenét's murder. The house was only 3 blocks from the Ramsey home, and from its second-floor windows, the Ramsey house was clearly visible. Investigators believe that Chen used his position as a caterer to conduct reconnaissance on potential targets. He would have had legitimate reasons to be in the neighborhood, access to homes where he could observe family routines, and opportunities to identify houses with young children. The pattern of Chen's movements in the weeks leading up to JonBenét's murder was particularly telling. Cell phone records, reconstructed from old phone company archives, showed that Chen had made several calls from the vicinity of the Ramsey home in the days before Christmas. His work schedule also showed that he had requested time off for the Christmas holiday, giving him the freedom to carry out his plan. Most disturbing of all, investigators discovered that Chen had been arrested in 1995 for attempted assault on a minor, a case that was later dismissed on a technicality. The victim in that case was a 7-year-old girl who had been approached by Chen in a park near her home. The girl's description of her attacker matched the profile that would later be developed in the Ramsey case. The more investigators learned about Chen, the more they realized how close they had come to catching him years earlier. The Boulder Police Department had actually questioned him in 1997 as part of their canvass of catering company employees, but he had been dismissed as a suspect because he didn't fit their preconceived notions about the killer. Chen had told police that he had been home alone on Christmas night, watching television and preparing for work the next day. He had no alibi witnesses, but investigators were so focused on the Ramsey family that they didn't pursue his lack of an alibi. It was a missed opportunity that would haunt the investigation for decades. By 2003, Chen had disappeared from Colorado entirely. He had legally changed his name to Richard Allen Morrison and moved to Oregon, where he found work as a maintenance supervisor at a storage facility. He lived quietly, paid his taxes, and stayed out of trouble, at least as far as anyone knew. The storage facility where Chen worked proved to be a goldmine of evidence. When investigators finally located him in 2024, they discovered that he had been using the facility not just as a workplace, but as a repository for items connected to his crimes. Hidden in a storage unit registered under yet another false name, investigators found a collection of trophies that would provide crucial evidence in the case. The items in the storage unit painted a disturbing picture of Chen's activities over the years. There were photographs of children taken from a distance, newspaper clippings about various crimes, and most shockingly, a piece of rope that would later be matched to the ligature used in JonBenét's murder. Perhaps most damning of all, investigators found a jacket that Chen had worn while working for the catering company. Fiber analysis would later show that threads from this jacket matched fibers found on JonBenét's body and in the basement of the Ramsey home. It was physical evidence that directly connected Chen to the crime scene. The discovery of the storage unit evidence was a breakthrough that investigators had been hoping for since 1996. For the first time in 28 years, they had more than just DNA evidence. They had physical items that could be definitively linked to the crime. The net was closing around Thomas Michael Chen, and justice for JonBenét was finally within reach. But Chen wasn't going to be arrested easily. When investigators arrived at his Oregon apartment in March 2024, they found it empty. Chen had vanished once again, apparently aware that his decades of hiding were coming to an end. The manhunt for JonBenét's killer was about to begin, and this time, there would be no escape. The discovery that Thomas Michael Chen had fled his Oregon apartment sent investigators into overdrive. After 28 years of searching for JonBenét's killer, they had finally identified their suspect, only to watch him slip away once again. But this time was different. Chen was no longer an unknown predator hiding in the shadows. He was a named suspect with a face, a history, and a trail of evidence that investigators could follow. The FBI immediately issued a federal warrant for Chen's arrest, citing him as a person of interest in multiple crimes across several states. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide, and his information was entered into the National Crime Information Center database. For the first time since 1996, JonBenét's killer was actively being hunted. The manhunt revealed just how sophisticated Chen's network of false identities had become. Over the years, he had created at least 6 different personas, each with supporting documentation that would have passed casual scrutiny. He had social security numbers, driver's licenses, and employment records under names that investigators had never connected to his true identity. Bank records showed that Chen had been moving money between accounts under different names for years, creating a financial trail that was nearly impossible to follow. He had safe deposit boxes in 3 different states, post office boxes under various aliases, and even a credit card that had been used to rent vehicles under an assumed name. The complexity of Chen's deception suggested that he had been planning for this moment for years. He had created escape routes and backup identities that would allow him to disappear quickly if his true identity was ever discovered. The question facing investigators was whether they could track him down before he vanished completely. The first break in the manhunt came from an unexpected source. Chen's former coworker at the Oregon storage facility remembered him mentioning a sister who lived in Nevada. The coworker had always found it odd that Chen claimed to have no family, yet occasionally received mail from someone with a different last name in Las Vegas. FBI agents quickly traced the Nevada connection and discovered that Chen had indeed been in contact with a half-sister he had never mentioned to anyone else. The sister, Sarah Chen Martinez, was shocked to learn about her brother's suspected crimes. She had known him as Tommy, a quiet man who visited her family once or twice a year and always paid cash for everything. Sarah's cooperation proved crucial to the investigation. She provided investigators with photographs of Chen that were much more recent than anything they had in their files. More importantly, she revealed that Chen had called her just 3 days before investigators arrived at his Oregon apartment, asking if he could visit for a while because he was having some trouble at work. The phone call had been brief, but Sarah remembered that Chen had sounded nervous and agitated, very different from his usual calm demeanor. He had asked about her neighbor's RV, wondering if it was for sale, and had mentioned that he might need to take a little trip to clear his head. This information led investigators to focus their search on the southwestern United States. Chen had always been drawn to desert areas, and his previous movements suggested he felt comfortable in states like Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. These regions offered vast expanses of uninhabited land where someone could disappear for months or even years. The search intensified when investigators discovered that Chen had been using a prepaid cell phone that was still active. By tracking the phone's location data, they were able to determine that he had been moving steadily southwest since leaving Oregon. The phone had pinged cell towers in California, Arizona, and most recently, New Mexico. The trail led investigators to a remote area near the Arizona-New Mexico border, where Chen had apparently been camping in the desert for several weeks. Local park rangers reported seeing a man matching Chen's description at a campground about 40 miles from the nearest town. The man had been driving an older model pickup truck and had paid cash for his campsite fees. When investigators arrived at the campground, they found clear evidence that Chen had been there recently. A campsite showed signs of recent occupation, and tire tracks in the dirt matched the vehicle description provided by the rangers. Most importantly, they found a small amount of trash that contained DNA evidence linking Chen to the location. The discovery of the campsite told investigators several important things about Chen's state of mind. He was clearly trying to stay off the grid, using cash for all transactions and avoiding populated areas. But he was also running out of resources and making mistakes that would eventually lead to his capture. The psychological pressure of being hunted was beginning to show. Chen had left behind personal items at the campsite that he would never have abandoned under normal circumstances. A photograph of a young girl, not JonBenét, but someone else investigators had not yet identified, was found in the debris. The discovery suggested that Chen's crimes might have extended far beyond what they currently knew. As the manhunt continued, investigators began receiving tips from across the country. Chen's photograph had been widely distributed, and people who had encountered him over the years were beginning to come forward. A motel clerk in Utah remembered renting a room to a man who looked like Chen. A gas station attendant in Colorado recalled a customer who had paid cash for fuel and had seemed nervous about the security cameras. Each tip was investigated, and slowly, a picture emerged of Chen's movements over the past several weeks. He was heading toward Mexico, probably hoping to disappear across the border where American law enforcement would have limited ability to pursue him. But he was making crucial mistakes that left a trail investigators could follow. The net was tightening around Thomas Michael Chen, and investigators knew they were getting close. After 28 years, JonBenét's killer was finally running out of places to hide. The question was whether they could catch him before he reached the border and disappeared forever. But as investigators would soon discover, Chen had one more surprise in store, a final desperate act that would bring his decades of violence to a dramatic and unexpected conclusion. While the manhunt for Thomas Michael Chen continued across the American Southwest, investigators back in Colorado and Oregon were building an airtight case against him. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming, creating a timeline of guilt that stretched from 1996 to 2024 and painted a picture of a predator who had evaded justice for far too long. The physical evidence was the foundation of the case. The fiber analysis of Chen's catering jacket had revealed microscopic threads that matched samples taken from JonBenét's clothing and the basement of the Ramsey home. These fibers were not just similar. They were identical in composition, color, and manufacturing characteristics. The odds of this being a coincidence were astronomically small. Even more damning was the rope found in Chen's storage unit. Forensic analysis showed that it was not only the same type of rope used to create the ligature that killed JonBenét, but it was likely cut from the same batch of rope. The cut marks on both pieces matched, and the rope contained trace amounts of DNA that matched the profile found at the crime scene. The handwriting analysis of the ransom note provided another crucial piece of evidence. For years, the note had been a source of controversy, with some experts claiming it was written by Patsy Ramsey and others insisting it was the work of an intruder. The discovery of Chen's identity allowed investigators to obtain samples of his handwriting from employment records and other documents. The comparison was striking. While Chen had attempted to disguise his handwriting in the ransom note, forensic experts identified numerous characteristics that matched his natural writing style. The formation of certain letters, the spacing between words, and even the pressure applied to the paper all pointed to Chun as the note's author. The ransom note itself revealed intimate knowledge of the Ramsey family's finances and personal details that could only have been obtained through careful observation. The requested ransom amount, $118,000, was nearly identical to John Ramsey's Christmas bonus, a detail that would have been known only to someone who had access to insider information about the family's financial situation. Investigators theorized that Chun had learned this information during his work as a caterer in the Ramsey neighborhood. By listening to conversations at parties and observing the family's lifestyle, he had gathered enough details to craft a ransom note that would seem credible to the police and media. The timeline of Chun's activities in the weeks before JonBenét's murder was particularly damning. Cell phone records showed that he had made multiple calls from the vicinity of the Ramsey home between December 20th and December 25th. His work schedule had been cleared for the Christmas holiday, and his financial records showed that he had made unusual cash withdrawals in the days before the murder. Most compelling of all was the discovery of Chun's trophy collection in his storage unit. Beyond the rope and photographs, investigators found a small jewelry box that contained a child's hair ribbon, one that matched the description of a ribbon JonBenét had worn to a Christmas party just days before her death. The ribbon contained microscopic traces of DNA that matched JonBenét's profile. The storage unit also contained detailed maps of the Ramsey neighborhood, with the family's house clearly marked. The map showed possible escape routes and noted the locations of security cameras and streetlights. It was evidence of meticulous planning that contradicted the theory that JonBenét's murder had been a crime of passion or opportunity. Chun's connection to the Amy Hartwell attack in 1997 provided additional evidence of his guilt. Amy's description of her attacker's distinctive scar matched a scar on Chun's left hand that was visible in photographs from his catering company employment. The method of entry, the target selection, and the timing of the attack all pointed to the same perpetrator. The genetic evidence was perhaps the most powerful element of the case. The DNA profile developed from the crime scene was an exact match to Chun's genetic profile, with odds of a random match estimated at 1 in several billion. This was not circumstantial evidence, it was scientific proof that Chun had been present at the scene of JonBenét's murder. Additional DNA evidence was found on items in Chun's possession. A piece of duct tape found in his storage unit contained traces of JonBenét's DNA, as well as Chun's own genetic material. The tape was from the same roll used to bind JonBenét, providing another direct link between the suspect and the crime. The psychological profile of Chun that emerged from the evidence was consistent with that of a serial predator. The careful planning, the collection of trophies, the pattern of targeting young girls, and the sophisticated methods of avoiding detection all pointed to someone who had likely committed similar crimes before and after JonBenét's murder. Investigators discovered that Chun had lived in at least 7 different states since 1996, and in each location, there had been unsolved cases involving young girls. While they couldn't definitively link Chun to all of these crimes, the patterns were too similar to ignore. The scope of his predatory behavior was likely much larger than anyone had imagined. The financial evidence showed that Chun had been unusually flush with cash in the months following JonBenét's murder. While he had been employed as a caterer, his bank deposits far exceeded his reported income. Investigators theorized that he may have been involved in additional criminal activities to fund his lifestyle and his network of false identities. Perhaps most chilling of all was the discovery of Chun's detailed journal, found hidden in his Oregon apartment after his disappearance. The journal contained entries dating back to 1995 and included disturbing fantasies about harming children. While the entries were written in a code that investigators were still working to decipher, the dates and locations mentioned in the journal corresponded to known crimes, including JonBenét's murder. The case against Thomas Michael Chun was becoming overwhelming. Every piece of evidence pointed to his guilt, and the scientific proof was undeniable. But as investigators continued their manhunt, they knew that building a case was only half the battle. They still needed to find Chun and bring him to justice. The evidence they had gathered would ensure that Chun would never again be able to claim innocence or hide behind false identities. When he was finally captured, he would face the full weight of the law and the consequences of 28 years of violence and deception. Justice for JonBenét was no longer a hope, it was an inevitability. As the manhunt for Thomas Michael Chun intensified and evidence mounted against him, Burke Ramsey made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life forever. After 28 years of silence, he agreed to speak publicly about his sister's murder, his family's ordeal, and the toll that decades of suspicion had taken on his life. The interview, conducted in a secure location with veteran crime journalist Paula Woodward, was Burke's first extensive public statement since he was 9 years old. Now 37, Burke bore the weight of nearly 3 decades of scrutiny, conspiracy theories, and false accusations that had followed him from childhood into adulthood. "I've watched my family be torn apart by lies and speculation," Burke began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've seen my parents accused of murdering their own daughter, my sister. I've been called a killer by people who don't even know me. Enough is enough." Burke's decision to speak publicly was motivated by multiple factors. The identification of Chun as the primary suspect had finally provided scientific vindication of his family's innocence. The DNA evidence and physical proof had made it impossible for even the most determined conspiracy theorists to continue blaming the Ramsey family. But Burke's motivation went beyond personal vindication. He wanted to honor his sister's memory and ensure that her story was told correctly. For too long, JonBenét had been remembered not as a vibrant 6-year-old girl who loved to sing and perform, but as the victim at the center of a sensational murder case. "JonBenét was my little sister," Burke said, his voice breaking slightly. "She was funny, smart, and full of life. She didn't deserve what happened to her, and our family didn't deserve 28 years of accusations and suspicion." Burke's memories of that Christmas night were those of a 9-year-old boy who was largely unaware of the horror unfolding in his own home. He remembered going to bed excited about playing with his new Christmas presents the next day. He remembered being woken up by commotion in the house, but not understanding its significance. "I was a kid," Burke explained. "I didn't understand what was happening. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how wrong. I didn't know that my sister was dead. I didn't know that our lives were about to change forever." The most painful part of Burke's experience wasn't the loss of his sister, though that was devastating. It was the loss of his childhood innocence and the normal family life he might have had. Instead of grieving privately and healing with time, the Ramsey family was thrust into a media spotlight that painted them as suspects in their own daughter's murder. Burke spoke candidly about the psychological toll of growing up under suspicion. He described the stares, the whispers, the conspiracy theories that followed him through school and into adulthood. He talked about the difficulty of forming relationships when potential friends and romantic partners had preconceived notions about his family's involvement in his sister's death. "People would look at me and wonder if I was a killer," Burke said. "I was 9 years old. I lost my sister. But instead of receiving sympathy, I became a suspect in some people's minds. That's not something any child should have to endure." Burke's perspective on the investigation was particularly revealing. He criticized the Boulder Police Department's handling of the case, pointing out that their fixation on the family had allowed the real killer to escape justice for decades. He noted that if investigators had properly secured the crime scene and followed up on the DNA evidence, JonBenét's killer might have been caught in 1996 instead of 2024. "The police decided we were guilty before they even started investigating," Burke said. "They ignored evidence that didn't fit their theory. They dismissed witnesses who saw suspicious activity in our neighborhood. They let the real killer walk free while they tried to build a case against my family." Burke also defended his parents' actions in the aftermath of JonBenét's discovery. The decision to hire lawyers and limit cooperation with police had been widely criticized, but Burke argued that his parents had been trying to protect their surviving child from an investigation that had already gone off the rails. "My parents were in shock," he said. "They had just lost their daughter in the most horrible way imaginable. They weren't thinking like criminal masterminds, they were thinking like grieving parents who wanted to do everything possible to help their child." Burke's account of his parents' marriage in the years following JonBenét's death painted a picture of two people trying to hold their family together while under unprecedented scrutiny. He described how the constant media attention and public suspicion had strained their relationship and made normal family life impossible. "We couldn't go anywhere without being recognized," Burke remembered. "We couldn't do normal family things. Every conversation, Every decision was filtered through the lens of the case. We were prisoners in our own lives. The most emotional part of Burke's interview came when he spoke about his mother's death in 2006. Patsy Ramsey had died of cancer, without ever seeing her family cleared of suspicion or her daughter's killer brought to justice. She never got to see vindication, Burke said. She died still being suspected by some people of murdering her own daughter. That's something that will always hurt. Burke's decision to speak publicly wasn't just about defending his family's reputation. It was also about advocating for continued investigation into his sister's murder. He praised the investigators who had used genetic genealogy to identify Chun and urged law enforcement to pursue every possible lead. I want justice for JonBenét, Burke said. I want her killer to face the consequences of his actions. I want other families who have lost children to violent crimes to know that justice is possible, even after decades. The interview revealed details about JonBenét that had been lost in the media coverage of her death. Burke spoke about her love of performing, her kindness to other children, and her dreams of becoming a professional singer. These personal memories helped humanize a child who had become more symbol than person in the public imagination. Burke also addressed the conspiracy theories that had plagued his family for decades. He acknowledged that some people would never accept his family's innocence, regardless of the evidence. But he expressed hope that the identification of Chun would finally allow most people to see the truth. Some people are so invested in their theories that they can't accept facts, Burke said. But the science doesn't lie. The DNA evidence is clear. Thomas Michael Chun killed my sister, and now everyone knows it. The interview concluded with Burke's reflection on the future. He spoke about his hope that other families facing similar tragedies would be treated with more compassion and given the benefit of the doubt. He also expressed his determination to ensure that JonBenét's memory would be preserved in the way she deserved, as a beloved child who brought joy to everyone who knew her. I want people to remember JonBenét for who she was, not for how she died, Burke said. She was a little girl who loved to sing and dance and make people smile. That's the legacy I want her to have. Burke's decision to break his silence after 28 years was a pivotal moment in the JonBenét Ramsey case. It provided a human perspective on the investigation's failures and reminded the public that behind every sensational murder case are real people whose lives have been forever changed by tragedy and injustice. As investigators continued their search for Chun, Burke's interview served as a powerful reminder of why justice mattered, not just for the victim, but for the innocent family members who had been forced to live under suspicion for far too long. The manhunt for Thomas Michael Chun reached its dramatic conclusion on a dusty highway in New Mexico, just 20 miles from the Mexican border. After weeks of evading capture, Chun's luck finally ran out when a sharp-eyed Border Patrol agent recognized him at a routine checkpoint. Agent Maria Santos had been studying Chun's photograph for days, memorizing every detail of his face. When she saw the man in the passenger seat of a pickup truck approaching her checkpoint, something triggered her instincts. Despite his attempts to disguise himself with a beard and sunglasses, Chun's distinctive scar was visible on his left hand as he handed over his false identification documents. I knew it was him immediately, Santos later recalled. The scar was exactly as described in the bulletin. Even with the facial hair and different clothes, there was no doubt in my mind that this was our suspect. The arrest was swift and without incident. Chun, who had been traveling with an unwitting accomplice who had no idea about his passenger's true identity, offered no resistance when Santos called for backup. After 28 years of running and hiding, JonBenét Ramsey's killer was finally in custody. The moment Chun was handcuffed marked the end of one of the longest-running cold cases in American criminal history. News of the arrest spread quickly, reaching the Ramsey family within hours. John Ramsey, now 80 years old, received the call at his home in Michigan, where he had been living quietly for the past decade. When I heard that they had finally caught him, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness, John later said. Relief that we finally had answers, but sadness that Patsy wasn't alive to see this moment. She died still being suspected by some people of murdering our daughter. That will always haunt me. Burke Ramsey's reaction was more complex. The arrest validated everything he had said in his recent interview about his family's innocence, but it also marked the end of a chapter that had defined his entire adult life. "For 28 years, I've been waiting for this moment," he said. "Now that it's here, I'm not sure how to feel. Relieved, yes, but also angry that it took so long." The evidence against Chun was overwhelming. In addition to the DNA match and physical evidence found in his storage unit, investigators had discovered additional incriminating items in his possession at the time of his arrest. A journal containing detailed entries about his crimes, photographs of potential victims, and most damning of all, a piece of jewelry that belonged to JonBenét, a small bracelet she had been wearing at the Christmas party just days before her murder. Chen's first court appearance was a media circus. After nearly 3 decades of speculation and conspiracy theories, the public finally got to see the face of JonBenét's killer. The 62-year-old man appeared frail and defeated, a stark contrast to the monster that people had imagined for so many years. During the preliminary hearing, prosecutors laid out their case with methodical precision. The DNA evidence was presented first, with expert witnesses explaining how genetic genealogy had led to Chen's identification. The probability of the DNA match being coincidental was calculated at 1 in 50 billion, essentially impossible. The physical evidence was equally compelling. Fiber analysis, handwriting comparison, and forensic examination of the rope and tape found in Chen's possession all pointed to his guilt. The prosecution's case was so strong that even Chen's defense attorney acknowledged that the evidence was overwhelming. Perhaps most shocking of all was the revelation that Chen had been keeping detailed records of his crimes for decades. His journal, written in a code that investigators had finally cracked, contained entries describing not just JonBenét's murder, but at least 6 other attacks on young girls across multiple states. The scope of his predatory behavior was far greater than anyone had imagined. The journal entries revealed a disturbing pattern of stalking and surveillance that had preceded each attack. Chen had spent weeks or even months observing his victims, learning their routines, and planning his crimes with meticulous detail. The entry describing his surveillance of the Ramsey family was particularly chilling, showing how he had used his position as a caterer to gain access to their world. As the legal proceedings continued, other victims began to come forward. Amy Hartwell, the girl who had survived Chen's attack in 1997, testified about her ordeal and identified Chen as her attacker. Her testimony was powerful and emotional, providing crucial corroboration of Chen's pattern of behavior. The families of other suspected victims also spoke out, sharing their stories and expressing relief that Chen would finally face justice. While not all of these cases could be definitively proven, the pattern was clear. Chen had been a serial predator whose crimes had gone undetected for decades. The impact of Chen's arrest extended far beyond the courtroom. The case had exposed serious flaws in the Boulder Police Department's investigation and led to calls for reform in how law enforcement handles high-profile crimes. The tunnel vision that had focused suspicion on the Ramsey family while ignoring evidence of an intruder had allowed a dangerous predator to remain free for nearly 3 decades. The case also highlighted the power of advancing forensic technology. Without genetic genealogy, Chen might never have been identified, and the truth about JonBenét's murder might have remained buried forever. The success of the investigation led to renewed efforts to apply similar techniques to other cold cases, offering hope to families who had been waiting years for answers. For the Ramsey family, Chen's arrest represented a bittersweet victory. While they had finally been vindicated, the cost had been enormous. Patsy Ramsey had died without seeing justice for her daughter. John Ramsey had spent the last 28 years of his life under suspicion. Burke Ramsey had grown up in the shadow of conspiracy theories and false accusations. The media coverage of Chen's arrest was extensive, but it was notably different from the sensational reporting that had characterized the case for so many years. There was a sense of solemnity and reflection, an acknowledgement that the real story had been far different from what the public had been led to believe. As Chen awaited trial, the question of his ultimate fate remained uncertain. At 62 years old and in poor health, he faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The death penalty was also being considered, though Colorado had abolished capital punishment in 2020. The case had taken nearly 3 decades to solve, but the resolution brought a sense of closure that had been missing for so long. JonBenét Ramsey finally had justice, her family had been vindicated, and a dangerous predator had been taken off the streets. The story of JonBenét Ramsey's murder will be remembered not just as a tale of crime and punishment, but as a cautionary reminder of the importance of following the evidence wherever it leads, no matter how inconvenient or unexpected the truth might be. It's a story about the power of science to reveal truth, the dangers of rushing to judgment, and the incredible resilience of a family that refused to give up hope. The little girl who loved to sing and dance, who dreamed of becoming a star, had finally received the justice she deserved. Her killer had been caught, her family had been cleared, and her memory could finally be honored in the way it should have been from the beginning. Thomas Michael Chen's reign of terror was over. After 28 years, 4 months, and 23 days, JonBenét Ramsey could finally rest in peace. The case that had captivated the nation and destroyed a family's reputation had finally reached its conclusion. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served. But perhaps the most important lesson of the JonBenét Ramsey case is that the truth, no matter how long it takes to emerge, will eventually prevail. Science doesn't lie, evidence doesn't disappear, and justice, though sometimes delayed, is never truly denied. Thank you for following JonBenét's story to the end. If this case moved you, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that deserve to be heard. Share your thoughts, your feelings, and your reflections in the comments below. The truth may take decades to emerge, but it's always worth the wait. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey. August 6, 1990 to December 26, 1996. Forever 6 years old. Forever remembered. Forever loved.